Hello, women's writing students, and welcome to your week 6 lecture pod. So we are continuing with our studies of Mary Shelley and the Mortal Immortal. There were some really good discussions last week in our seminars. We focused largely on genre, so we thought a lot about the genre of this story, and we reminded ourselves about the Gothic genre of writing, and in particular we talked quite a bit about the female Gothic as well. And we thought about the ways in which this story fits into that kind of writing, that mode of writing. We thought about some Gothic motifs and tropes, recurring images and themes across different kinds of Gothic literature. And we began to think about how they might apply to the story that we are reading. So hopefully you enjoyed getting into some of that Gothic literature and getting into the story. This week I'm going to open up these slides here just on my screen so you can see them as well. So this week we are going to focus a little bit more on gender and the female body. This came up in a lot of the discussions in the classroom, and I want to carry these discussions a little bit further. So if I dive in here, I want to begin thinking a little bit about the female body. I had shown you an image, you'll remember, an engraving, which accompanies the story. It accompanies The Mortal Immortal in its original publication in that gift annual. You'll remember I talked about the gift annual, the keepsake, and we had a look at that image and we thought a little bit about feminine identity, and I want to kind of carry on some of that conversation, and I want to focus in particular on some things that we said in terms of the Gothic and the feminine and the female body. So I flagged this quotation from Diana Wallace and Andrew Smith to students in the earlier learning pod for the study on Shelley. We're going to just cover over it again one more time just to remind you. So this is Wallace and Smith. And they're talking about the female Gothic, specifically about the female Gothic, and they said that it's a politically subversive genre that articulates women's dissatisfactions with patriarchal structures and offers a coded expression of their fears of entrapment within the domestic and within the female body. And I want to focus particularly today on that idea of entrapment within the female body and also within the domestic and what that means in our story. So I want to focus quite a lot on Bertha in today's lecture pod. I also pulled out this quotation. Many of the stories that we study on this unit are actually taken from an anthology, 19th century short stories by women. It's a Routledge anthology edited by Harriet Devine Jump, and I've quoted from Devine Jump before. And again, I just wanted to pull out this quotation from her introduction to the volume. You'll remember at the very beginning of this unit, we did think a little bit, or I encouraged you to think a little bit about why the short story, what does the short story format offer? And we've talked a lot about the Gothic genre, and we've talked a lot about why women might choose that genre in terms of the particular things that they want to explore. And one of the things that Devine Jump talks about relates in particular to this idea of gender and the body, and what I'm going to talk about today in the lecture pod. She says that women's short stories in the 19th century, across many of them, show a recurring interest in women's lives. So they talk about their relationships with men, they talk about their social position and status, they talk about their choices, and they talk about their emotions. And I, in particular, want to think about choices. So I want to talk about entrapment within the domestic and the female body. And I want to think about how that relates to women's choices, particularly Bertha's choices in the text. I want to remind you of the image. This is the image that appeared in the short story when it was first published. This is the image of Bertha, and that's her protectress or her adoptive mother. And there's a picture of the old woman's page boy just there in the background holding up her dress. And we talked a little bit about the light and the colour imagery in this image. You know, Bertha is kind of to the foreground in some way. She's bright and white and sort of pure and virginal, and we talked about a kind of mode of femininity that she seems to encapsulate or to represent, particularly in contrast to the older woman who comes across as kind of darker and more in shadow in the picture. We said before that this is a kind of foreshadowing of events to come, that Bertha will age, unlike her husband Windsor, and this causes all sorts of problems in the story for their relationship, for their marriage, and for eventually what becomes of both of them in many ways. And other critics have also commented on this engraving and thought about how significant it is and how we can read it in terms of the story. Sonia Hofkosh says that the engravings in these stories function to reveal an incipient commodity culture, a culture which posits women as the object of the male gaze, multiplying and marketing that view of them so insistently and persuasively that even they can look at themselves through no other eyes. So the idea is that we get one idea of femininity, that pure, virginal, almost infantile image that we just looked at there of Bertha, and that becomes the image that's repeated time and time and time again in these engravings, in these gift annuals, in these short stories. And that in this way, women become part of the commodity culture. Remember, we said that the gift annual was a sort of almost a kind of cultural or status symbol. It was very lavishly illustrated. It was a very expensive literary commodity, and to own one said something about your kind of cultural and your wealth status within society. So the engravings inside, the images themselves, also become part of this kind of commodity culture, that the women become part of this. They are women viewed in terms of the male gaze. They are objects of the male gaze. And I want to think about how they are objects in a broader kind of commodity culture, particularly when we think about marriage in the 19th century, that marriage also is a bit of an economy or commodity culture where women are sort of traded in some ways between families. Again, they become objects in all sorts of ways. And this raises an interesting question when we begin to look at Bertha within these kind of larger contexts around commodity culture and the male gaze and gender and the female body and how it's figured and represented in these stories and in these images. It does raise a bit of a question, I think, in the story. And that question is whether Bertha is a Gothic victim in the story, or whether she is a villain, a villainess, or perhaps she is a bit of both. It's worth thinking about when we first meet Bertha. And when we first meet Bertha, of course, we meet her because Windsor has just run. He has fled from Agrippa's hellish abode. He's run away from this kind of Satan-like figure and says he's not going to work for him anymore. One of the first images that we get of Bertha is actually of her beauty. So she is described to us, again, in physical terms, in terms of the male gaze, and in this case, in terms of Windsor's gaze. She's a dark-haired girl with beaming eyes. But as the description goes on in the story, there are sort of, I suppose, less nice descriptions of Bertha. We're told that she's haughty, that she has an impatient spirit, that she is a coquette, a sort of a bit of a flirt or a tease in her manner. We're told that she can be cross and angry, and it seems almost as if she manipulates Windsor. She pressures him to go back to Agrippa to earn money, and she thinks of the money more than she thinks of anything else, we're told, in that particular conversation. As their marriage goes on, she becomes jealous. She becomes jealous of the fact that she is aging and that Windsor isn't. And by the time Windsor is describing her last moments of life, he describes her as a mincing, simpering, jealous old woman with her beauty long gone and sort of only remembered really by Windsor himself. So all in all, we don't get a great impression of Bertha in many ways, and she can seem a bit of a villain in the story in the sense that it seems that she has some kind of power over Windsor because he's in love with her, and he uses this word himself, that she has power over me. He drinks the elixir because he wants to be cured of his infatuation with her. So in all sorts of, in a large way, Bertha comes across as a bit of a villain in the story. She certainly doesn't come across in a particularly good light. But I want to think about how we might look at her in a different way as well. That this seems to be a sort of surface narrative in the story, but when we look quite closely at the language that is used concerning particularly Bertha's position in the household with the old woman, that maybe there is room for a more sympathetic reading of Bertha, and again I kind of want to turn our attention a little bit to that. If we have a look at the moment, the engraving, the picture in the story is the moment where Bertha is about to leave the old woman's home. She's about to say, well, actually, do you know what, I've had enough. I'm not going to marry this Arthur Hoffer, and I don't want to stay in this house anymore. And even if it means living a life of poverty, I welcome that poverty, and I just kind of, I'm going to go. And she goes off with Windsor, and that's the beginning of their marriage. But let's have a little bit of a look. So again, we want to think about choice. What choice does Bertha have? Let's remember that her parents, she's orphaned at quite a young age. This old sort of wealthy heiress in the community decides to adopt her. And let's remember that she probably wouldn't adopt her if Bertha hadn't been a sort of renowned young beauty in the community as well. Takes her in, she gets used to and accustomed to a very different lifestyle, attempts to keep up some communication with Windsor and his family because they've been childhood friends and neighbours, but the old woman is quite against this, and tries to set her up with a more socially acceptable marriage, given her now wealthy status. So in a certain way, we could see this as kind of, this is lucky for Bertha that she's taken in these ways. But again, let's have a look at the language. When Bertha attempts to leave the old woman, this is the moment where she sees Windsor, and this is the moment where she leaves. And it says that the old highborn hag, who called herself her protectress and was her tyrant, stopped my fair girl with a "How now, my bold mistress, whither so fast? Back to your cage, hawks are abroad." How I abhorred the old crone who checked the impulses of my Bertha's softening heart. She had that morning been persecuted with more than usual vehemence. To consent to an immediate marriage with my rival, she was reproached with the encouragement that she had shown him. She was threatened with being turned out of doors with disgrace and shame. My mother received the fair fugitive, escaped from a gilt cage to nature and liberty. And again, if you have a look at the words that I've tried to highlight there in blue, the protectress is described as a tyrant. Bertha's life is described as living in a gilt cage with hawks, potentially, kind of vultures and hawks, preying on her. It's not always clear who these hawks might be, although certainly Windsor is kind of pinpointed by the old hag in this particular scene. She has been persecuted with vehemence. She has been reproached and threatened. She's described as a fugitive. So again, think about the language that is being used here. It turns the story of Bertha's kind of lucky escape from rags to riches into something quite different, that she is entrapped within this kind of cage and that she has to live up to this. She's been persecuted to consent to an immediate marriage, and then when she doesn't want to, she's reproached because of the encouragement that he has shown him, and she's threatened with being turned out of doors with disgrace and shame. So again, there's a kind of blackmail going on here. Well, you kind of went hunting with Arthur Hoffer and you've kind of courted him now, and to turn away from his kind of offer of marriage is kind of fall into disgrace and shame. Again, that idea of the coquette. So there's also a kind of manipulation going on here in terms of the protectress, who is very keen for Bertha to marry Arthur Hoffer, and possibly for her own gain and her own benefit in an economic way. Bertha here is being used as a kind of pawn in some kind of economic transaction that will enable the woman to kind of pass on her aristocratic wealth. Remember, she's childless apart from her adoption of Bertha. So there's all sorts of strange machinations going on in the background to this, and certainly the language that is being used seems to suggest that Bertha is left with very little choice in her decision making. And maybe that makes us look again at some of her earlier behaviour with Windsor. She pressures Windsor enormously to make money. She is deeply concerned in many ways about her future security. And again, if we think about it in the larger context of marriage in the 19th century, we've talked about this before on the unit, that there weren't many pathways for women. Think about the old widow woman in the Limerick Gloves who lives a life of impoverishment because she is widowed. She has no husband to look after, and she has to rely on the charity of other people in the community because she can't work for herself. She lacks an education, as many women did in the 19th century, but also professional work was deemed again kind of socially unacceptable. So think again from Bertha's perspective, and this is important because we don't actually get Bertha's perspective anywhere in the story. This is completely told from Windsor's point of view. So when we start to look at this language that's being used, when we start to think about Bertha in a wider context, even if it doesn't enable us to excuse her behaviour towards Windsor or that manipulation of him, it does begin to put it into a new light, and it begins to make us think about choices and what choices women might or might not have had in the 19th century. And I certainly think it makes us look at Bertha in a more sympathetic light. This also brings us back to a conversation that we had last week in the seminar, and this was about Windsor and his narration. We also looked at some of the imagery at the beginning of the story, and I'm going to repeat some of that imagery here. It's clear in the opening pages of the story that Windsor is very much associated with Agrippa, and he's associated with that ever-burning fire in his kind of alchemist's abode, where he's kind of burning and cooking up his potions and his chemicals. And so there's images of Satan, there's images of foul fiends, there's images of hellfire. And this hellfire itself has a larger kind of imagery around the masculine, around things that are unnatural, around things that are hellish. And Windsor certainly seems to be positioned in that camp. When we first meet Bertha, however, there's a deep contrast in those two passages. When we meet Bertha, she is associated more with the feminine, with beauty, with naturalness, and also with water. The rushing waters that Windsor crosses when he goes to meet her, and we can think about that contrast as a contrast between heaven and hell, the fires of hell and the rushing fountains and waters of heaven. So there seems to be in the imagery of the story a bit of a divide, a bit of a demarcation between Windsor, who's kind of associated with the masculine and the more hellish side, the hellish imagery in the story, and Bertha, who's more associated with the kind of heavenly or feminine aspects and imagery in the story. And again, this positions Bertha differently, because the surface story tells us something about Bertha which is quite negative, but the imagery seems to tell us something that is quite positive, just as the imagery earlier and that language used seemed to suggest that there is something entrapping in Bertha's life. She's trapped in her own kind of feminine presence, in her own kind of female body, which has to live up to a certain kind of feminine ideal. And finally, just to end this lecture pod, again to kind of go back and to think about how some of this might make us think again about what we were talking about last week in the seminar. Again, I showed this slide in the last lecture pod, and we began to think a little bit about why Windsor writes his story down. And we talked a little bit about the confessional narrative, you remember, confessional literature, and we had a careful look at some of the things that he says, you know, allowing the reader to judge for him. He's wanting to leave a name behind for himself. In light of this conversation, though, around gender and the body, and again that imagery of Windsor in the hellfire and Bertha kind of in the heavenly waters, is it worth thinking again about how this kind of narration that we're given by Windsor is deeply unstable, it's deeply ambiguous. We're not sure by the end of the story how far we trust some of Windsor's narration. He clearly wants to come off in a good light in the story. But the imagery also refocuses on Bertha, I think. Are there things that we don't or are not told about Bertha? Are there ways in which we haven't been able to see her story? And does that make Windsor guilty in some way? In order to make himself come off good in the story, it seems that he has to cast Bertha in that kind of villainess light. And there could be some questioning or ambiguity around that. And that's what I want us to talk about this week, a little bit in our seminar on Wednesday, to think carefully about Bertha. Are there ways of looking at her more sympathetically in the story, certainly than the surface narrative leads us to believe? So I'm looking forward to talking about this all with you on Wednesday. Take care for now, and I will catch up with you soon.